Hey, Armand here to answer a question about retrograde planets in the natal chart and what happens when those planets go retrograde in the sky. It's a good question. Now, listen, supposing you have a question that you want me to answer, general astrology question, not about your chart. Your chart, get a consultation. But if you have a general question like this that you'd like answered, by all means, I'll be happy to do so. You can type it in the comments down below. Symbol for typing. So you can type it in the comments down below. You can go to armanddiaz.com and send me an email. You could concentrate on it really, really hard and psychically send it to me. But I think the first two methods probably going to work best. I miss a lot of stuff when it comes to the other thing, because all sorts of things buzzing around. So let's talk about retrograde planets in the natal chart and what it means when those planets go retrograde in the sky. Okay, so we're going to divide this up into three sections. First, we're going to talk about retrograde planets in the natal chart. Then we're going to talk about what happens when those same planets go retrograde in the sky. And then for those of you that can stick out to the end of it over here, stick with this to the end. Then we're going to talk a little bit something a little bit drop more advanced that you could look at, and that's kind of going to be helpful to you. So let's talk about planets that are retrograde in the natal chart first. We're going to divide this into three groups. And the three groups are the outer planets, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. That's group one. And then we're going to talk about Mars and Venus. That's group two. And then Mercury. He's in his own little group. Okay, so Jupiter through Pluto, just taken as a whole, Jupiter through Pluto are retrograde a lot of the time, somewhere between 4 to almost 6 months of the year. Some of them have wonky orbits. It makes it a little bit, a lot of the time they are retrograde. Doesn't really mean that much. Okay, half the population roughly has Pluto retrograde or Neptune retrograde. Not getting a lot of stuff out of that. However, it doesn't not mean anything when Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto are retrograde in the natal chart. The energy, you should know, is not weak. It's not like these planets are weak. They're actually strong. They're considered to be quite strong when they're retrograde. Their proximity to the Earth. If you notice when a planet stations to go retrograde, and if it's a planet that you can see, any planet that you can see when it's retrograde is going to be brighter. Right? They're really shining out there. So they're not weak. However, the energy is directed a little bit more internally. Now, when we talk about Jupiter through Pluto, this is especially true. Well, it's true. It's true with all of them. But we just think about it this way. Jupiter is the planet of expansion, but maybe, and it's expansion and growth and how we get out there. Maybe there's just a little drop of hesitancy there. Maybe there's a little bit of thinking about what we're going to do before we do it. Saturn is a planet of structure and limitations. And when Saturn is retrograde, I think what happens is that we kind of provide our own limitations, right? We are right there for it. I don't need you to tell me because I'll figure it out myself. With Uranus, the planet of independence and the way you're going to do things in kind of novel sort of way. When it's retrograde, we have to kind of figure out what is it? What is it that I want to do my way? It's not quite so automatic. We have to think about it a little bit. Pluto is power, and Pluto is externalized. Tends to be the person that we have to deal with that we don't really want to. And Pluto is retrograde. We tend to pull that energy inwards a little bit more. We tend to be a little bit more cautious about how we express our power. Neptune is a little bit difficult to talk about because Neptune itself is sort of an internalized kind of energy. It's sort of a retrograde planet all the time. Uh, we're going to go inward and we're going to try to sort things out in terms of our dreams, our illusions and delusions. We're going to do that a little bit more on a personal level, but it's a personal level anyway. But we're going to step back from them a little bit and perhaps question them. So when the outer-ish planets are retrograde, there's a little bit more of that stop, take a minute, figure out what it is I want to do. I'm going to expand, I'm going to grow. Where and how? So there's that kind of thing, but it's not really such a big deal. It's not such a big deal because the energy is there for half the population, right? It's not, or a third of the population. It's not such a big deal. Okay. Second group, Mars and Venus. Now, Mars and Venus rarely go retrograde. Each of them goes retrograde about once every 2 years. That's not literally true, but it's a pretty good ballpark estimate. Venus about every 18 months and Mars once in his 2 year cycle. It's a little more unusual to have Venus or Mars retrograde, in other words. Now, this does not mean that you'll never have love, Venus retrograde, or that you'll never have sex, or you'll never get things done, Mars retrograde. What happens, though, is again, there's a hesitation, there's a pulling inwards of the energy. So with Venus, Venus retrograde in the natal chart is very much about, well, what do I want? What do I value? What do I desire? Right? There's going to be a processing that goes on with Venus retrograde. It's not automatic. And if you have Venus retrograde, you know what I'm talking about. If not, it's typical that you kind of, when something appeals to you, you know it. When you with what do I want? It's easy to come up with the list. With Venus retrograde, you have to do a little bit more reflection to get in there and come up with that list. Mars retrograde. Now, remember, this has nothing to do with Venus and Mars or any other planet when they are retrograde in the sky. We're talking about in the natal chart. And when Mars is retrograde in the natal chart, the same thing happens with action, right? And drive. Right? Again, how am I going to go get that thing? There's going to be a moment of hesitation. Or maybe it's not just a moment, there's going to be some hesitation. How do I go about this? Do I go about this? There's a little bit more consideration and questioning. It does not. And of course, we'd have to look at the sign. We would have to look at the aspect. We'd have to look at a lot of different things to really get the picture for somebody. But when Mars is retrograde, the question comes up, you know, am I going to do this? Am I going to do this? And how am I going to do it? And there's a little bit of hesitation in there. So it's not bad, and you'll get it sorted sooner or later. It's not the immediate action, though. Even Mars in Aries is going to be a little bit more hesitant. Like, okay, do I? Do I? And then we get to Mercury retrograde. Mercury is retrograde a fair amount of the time, as we know, right? It's about 9 weeks out of the year he's retrograde, and then we have the shadow periods. Well, hold on to that thought for a minute. But Mercury's retrograde fairly frequently. When Mercury's retrograde, that same hesitation can come up in communication and thought processes, and it's not a bad thing at all. It's a little bit of a step back, a little bit and this can be all of these hesitations can be fairly minor. They can go by very, very quickly. It's just that there's a checking internally before externalizing. More people should have Mercury retrograde, I think. That would be better for all of us in a way. There's a little checking when Mercury goes retrograde. That's just having Mercury retrograde, when Mercury's retrograde in the natal chart. That's just a little bit of time to check things out, a little bit of let me see, is this really what I'm hearing? Is this really what I want to say? Not a bad thing in and of itself. Okay, let's talk about when those planets go retrograde in the sky. When currently we have a retrograde of any of these things. Well, if we're talking Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, they're retrograde so much of the time. The effect to the natal chart, it's fairly minimal. I think things feel normal. You have the planet retrograde, the planet is retrograde. It just feels kind of normal. We're not going to worry about them. I'm not saying that there's no effect. I'm not saying that for some people, the way things kind of work out, it isn't a little bit more significant. But on average, it just doesn't make that much of a difference. They're retrograde so much of the time. About the most that you would get would be the feeling of familiarity. This seems to be the way things are. Well, it's okay with me because this is the way things are. When Venus and Mars go retrograde, we get a little bit of a chance to revisit the as when Venus and Mars are retrograde for everybody. We're all in this sort of thinking about things and incorporating the messages of Venus, or we're waiting on the actions of Mars. So if you have the planet retrograde in your chart, that still is the way things are for you. It's still not a great time to begin a new relationship if Venus is retrograde. Not a great time to buy luxury items and so on. And with Mars, it's not a great time to start a new job. So if you have it retrograde in your chart, it's the same as it is for everybody who has it. Maybe. And then we'll throw Mercury into this at the same time as well. When Mercury is retrograde in the sky, and we have a nice large sample set for this because Mercury retrogrades do matter. It does kind of matter in the natal chart. I'm not blowing that off. And we get to see Mercury going retrograde quite frequently. And what people have Mercury retrograde in the natal chart will tell you about Mercury retrograde in the sky is that they have the same kinds of mercurial mishaps, but they tend to resolve themselves rather quickly and easily. And I think we can extrapolate that to Mars and Venus as well. So people that have Mars and Venus retrograde, those same kinds of retrograde cautions should apply. But if you get yourself into a bit of a jam, you probably can get out of it or resolve it in a fairly good way without too much trouble. So maybe that will help. Still in all, the energy of Venus retrograde is not great for beginning some stuff. Mars retrograde is not great for beginning some things. And you want to kind of pay attention to that, whether you have the planet retrograde in your chart or not. It's not a free pass, in other words. It's not a free pass. You might be able to, it might be the get out of jail free card for you, but you don't want to go to jail, right? All right. With that in mind, so the basic answer to the question is it doesn't matter too much. It doesn't matter too much if the planet's retrograde in your chart, and it doesn't matter all that much when the planet goes retrograde in the sky. Venus and Mars retrograde in the natal chart are probably the ones that would carry the most power, and it might help when those planets go retrograde in the sky. Now, for those of you that have followed along this far and know a little bit of astrology, we can talk about the technique of secondary progressions. Because what happens almost always with Mercury, if you live past 21, it certainly happens. And it very likely will happen with Venus and Mars, and especially Venus, and it might happen with the other planets, is that by secondary progression, the planets that are retrograde will station and then go direct. Now, the whole thing that comes out of that, there's a lot of things to consider. So you could really, really talk about this, and I'm not going to talk about the full effect of this and how it has, there's a lot of life lessons that come out of this when the planet stations and goes direct again. In fact, those of us that have the planets direct in our chart, by secondary progression, they may go retrograde. With secondary progression, you move the chart forward 1 day for each year. So if you were born on September 21st, 1967, let's say, at age 5, it would be the chart for September 26th, 5 days later, 1967. Right. So you just move the chart forward. So, when you're 70, it's like the chart for 70 days after you were born, even though you're 70 years older. It's a day for a year kind of thing. Another discussion for another time. But you can pick up the ephemeris, or you can sometimes just move your chart forward and look and see, hey, this planet was retrograde in my natal chart, but now it's direct. Those changes that happen, or the planet was direct and it changed and it went retrograde, those types of changes that happen are pretty significant. We typically, in the area of life indicated by the planet, we tend to have very significant years right around the station time, when it stations to go retrograde or stations to go direct. So if you were born, like you could say, well, I'm born with Mercury retrograde, but maybe 3 days after you were born, in real time, and 3 days later, Mercury stationed and went direct. That means that by secondary progression, since age 3, Mercury is direct in your chart. What it essentially does, and this could be a big discussion, but what it essentially does when a retrograde planet goes direct by secondary progression is that it kind of undoes the effect of the retrograde. You become more accustomed to, let's say with Mars, you act a little bit quicker. Doesn't quite override the retrograde in the natal chart. There's always going to be that there, but it tends to be a little bit less of an issue. Then again, if you just kind of work on things, if you take your time and say, okay, I'm going to figure out how to work with this retrograde, that usually works pretty well too. And you don't have to wait for things to turn around by secondary progression. Okay, you have a question? Send it to me. If I answered it for you satisfactorily, that's good. If I didn't, we'll try again.